A lot of the comments that I got on my Godzilla Minus One video were that I needed to check out Shin Godzilla, as that was the best modern Godzilla movie. So I watched it last night on Crunchyroll, and it was definitely pretty good. So I want to talk about the differences between Shin and Minus One and which one I like better. Some of the things that I thought were really interesting were the different themes, and obviously a big part of that is the different eras. But the theme of Godzilla Minus One was much more about overcoming fear and kind of a person's journey and dealing with survivor's guilt and PTSD and what is really family. Obviously, the girl that he's living with just kind of ended up at his house. The baby that they end up with was neither of theirs. So there's kind of this hodgepodge family trying to come together and rebuild after World War II. Shin Godzilla didn't really focus too much on any specific character because there was a lot of people involved. And the main thing that really touched on was bureaucracy and the citizens kind of taking matters into their own hands, which Minus One touched on a little bit, but that was really the focal point of Shin Godzilla. And there's a scene in here that really resonated with me where a decision needs to be made and you can see it go through like 10 people before it gets to an answer. Because I don't want to sidetrack too much because you don't care about me, you want to talk about Godzilla. But my actual job is a construction engineer. I had that exact situation on a job site. I was contracted to the government. The other group was contracted to the government. We had different roles. And we were both contracted to the government, but I wanted to ask this other guy a question. He was standing 5 feet from me. So I had to ask my boss, who asked her boss, who asked his boss, who asked a project engineer, who asked the other company's project engineer, who then told the guy the answer. So it took 15 minutes to get an answer to a really basic question. And that's kind of how the government functions in the whole first part of this movie, which I think is interesting. And that's kind of the main character, Yaguchi. His issue that he really seems to have is kind of the red tape and just how much the government slows things down. And he even complains, not openly, he's more grumbling. One of the government officials says, well, we only had 2 hours, so that was a decent response. And he goes, you mean we had 2 hours and we did nothing? So I really like that whole kind of back and forth between the bureaucrats. And you can see all these different scenes where they're like looking for contracts and legalities. And they're like, who has this authority? Who can approve this? And it is frustrating in an emergency situation when you're trying to get stuff done, how much the bureaucracy slows stuff down. And unfortunately, it's one of the strengths and weaknesses of having a government like that. Obviously, if you have a monarch or authoritarian government, they say, hey, we're doing this, and that's it. And it just gets passed down, and there's no questions asked. But then with that, you sacrifice a lot of freedom, a lot of flexibility, because everyone below you is afraid to do anything. So it's really interesting, the kind of the perspective on the government that Shin Godzilla took. Another thing I thought was really interesting, and this is the difference between the Godzillas as opposed to the themes, is the way that they evolved. In Godzilla Minus One, he starts out as about 40 or 50 feet tall, which many people correct me because I said two-story house, which I guess is like 25 feet, which is fine. I don't really care. The point was that he went small to big, but he started out however tall, let's just say 50 feet. And then because of US nuclear testing, he ends up growing to skyscraper size and like 200 tons, which was also something I misspoke and said 20 tons. In Shin Godzilla, he starts out as like this kind of weird fish thing with legs. So he's kind of like scraping his face off the ground. And his eyes look a little bit wonky because they're designed for water. So they have like a film on them and they're like on the sides and they're really big. And he actually evolves kind of through time, the way that we see evolution in this movie. You can see here he's transforming from this kind of fish lizard thing that crawls along the ground to standing up on hind legs. And it's kind of hard to see here, but you can see his upper hands growing in, his face and mouth are kind of changing size. He had gills before. So I thought that was a really interesting way to do the evolution too. I'm not even sure if I prefer one to the other. I mean, it makes him way more powerful, I think, in Shin Godzilla to literally like enhance his species. But in Minus One, I think it's probably more logical that he feeds off radiation and our nuclear testing and plants and waste and all that just make him grow rapidly. I don't know, they're very different, but definitely an interesting change there. Here's the part that I was talking about. I'll see if I can play a little bit and not get hit by copyright. I'll just keep the audio off. But you can see there's like two civilians walking by in the distance. So the guy on the gun in the helicopter says, can we fire? And I really like that little part right there where they're fucking sitting next to each other. And the Zazen, I think is his name, I think he's a general, says to her, there's civilians there, can we fire? And she turns to the prime minister at the end of the table and goes, Mr. Prime Minister, can we fire? And it's a really nice touch because when you're in the government, if you ever worked for the government, that is exactly how it feels. Like you want to do stuff if you're a productive person, not like a parasitic government employee. And everything that you try to do is just chopped off at the knees by red tape and bureaucracy. If you ever work a government job, it is so frustrating to deal with. Because the other way that's frustrating is you have these problems that are very simple to change solutions to or resolve, but you have to go through all kinds of steps of people above you. What really ends up happening is if people are more efficient at their jobs, they worry that they're going to lose job security. So the government employees, and I don't think it's malicious, I think it's just how people behave, become protective of their income, which, people have families and lives and blah, blah, blah. So you end up with all these people who are like, well, my job is really important, so we probably shouldn't streamline this thing that could get rid of me or reduce the amount of work that I have or whatever. So I thought that was a really nice scene and a really nice way to do that. Another theme throughout Shin Godzilla that I really appreciated is the idea of the burdens of leadership. And you see this throughout the movie, from the prime minister to all the different cabinet people to the little kind of group of hodgepodge weirdos that come together under Yaguchi. You have all these different groups, and this is something you see throughout where the leadership is always afraid to do anything because there is no good solution. When they're debating whether or not to fire on Godzilla, they had to protect the civilians because they don't want to kill their own civilians, but then Godzilla knocks over a whole apartment building. And either way, you're going to be made out to be the bad guy, and people are going to Monday morning quarterback and say, oh, you should have done this, obviously. And that's something you see throughout history. You'll hear it all the time from historians who talk about colossal mistakes that people made. Maybe at the time they were colossal mistakes and they were bad decisions, but it's very harsh treatment to look back on something when you have unlimited time, you have no pressure, you have no blood on your hands to just say, oh, well, they screwed up. And this is something we see throughout, where everyone who's in a leadership position is very uncomfortable because they know that they're going to get blamed no matter what. And I think that's a pretty good point. The counterpoint that I would make is in times of peace, when you're a politician, they're pretty corrupt, generally speaking, and they take advantage of their position in all kinds of ways. So to me, as far as politicians go, fuck them, I don't care. But as far as regular people go, like if you run your own business or you're a manager or whatever, I hear this all the time from people who run things where the people under them complain, like, oh, we should do this and we should do this. Why are we doing it this way? And they're constantly bitching and think that they should be in charge until they actually have to make a tough decision where no one's going to be happy. Or until there's company layoffs and you're the one telling people, hey, you just lost your job because the business isn't doing well. I think it's a very fair point about leadership overall. Specifically as far as politicians, I had no sympathy. That's just generally how I feel. It doesn't have anything to do with political party or any particular politician. I just don't like them. This is about halfway through the movie when Godzilla is really showing his power level. And this part, I can definitely see why people think that this Godzilla is the coolest one. Like, there's a pretty cool shot here. I'm going to see if I can find it in just a minute. But this is when he's about to nuke this entire area. And it's funny that he has pink scales and like a pink laser and stuff, because apparently that's been a complaint about the Godzilla Kong Empire trailer, is that Godzilla has pink scales now. And I don't know if people think it's political or they just don't like the way that it looks or what. It's just funny that that's like a weirdly controversial thing. And this one came out a few years ago and has pink scales and pink laser beams and all that. The only thing I would say about the Godzilla Kong Empire one is I don't really understand why it would change unless the pink is supposed to be more powerful, because he was blue in all the previous movies. So anyway, this is a pretty cool scene. And this might be the most dickish that Godzilla has been, where he just vomits like radioactive shit everywhere and then starts going crazy with this pink laser beam and fire and pink beams off his back. He's essentially a walking power plant. And obviously the nuclear stuff is always going to be a theme of Godzilla because that's what inspired it. He's somehow always tied into radiation or radioactivity. There's not too much to say about that other than he is always kind of symbolic of nuclear destruction, which I can understand why Japan would be hung up on that, given the 2 atomic bombs and then more recently Fukushima. I just wanted to share this real quick because this is a pretty cool shot too, where he's all lit up and just torching everything around him. It's always hard to tell for me if Godzilla is supposed to be evil or he simply just exists and this is a consequence of his existence. I think him simply existing would make more sense for the idea of the nuclear commentary, but the American ones made him like this weird kind of anti-hero peacekeeper thing and like the retaliation of the earth or something. It's all, I don't really like that take. Like Minus One, they say he's territorial, so he views a certain area as his territory. and he kind of just goes where he pleases. And Shin, they don't really say, they just treat him like a monster. And then he seems to go out of his way and just blow shit up, which makes him seem more evil. So, I don't know. The one thing I'm not sure how I feel about, and I wouldn't say it bothers me, but it's just a different style, is how over the top the destruction is in this one compared to Minus One. Because in Minus One, it's kind of like just wherever he walks, he destroys because he's so big, except for when he does the big power up and launches the nuke. In this one, he's like going crazy with these laser beams coming out of his dorsal spikes, and you can see he's shooting all over the city. And I guess the way that I would view it is if Minus One was like Superman Returns or like one of the older Superman shows or movies, Shin Godzilla would be like Man of Steel, where it's like the collateral damage and the explosions and shit are just out of control, like flattening everything. And I wouldn't say it's good or bad, it's just a way different style. And there's an interesting little thing here too, and I'm not going to go too long on this, but these two talk about positions in the new cabinet because everyone's been wiped out. And Yaguchi says essentially that the other guy screwed him over because now he's in a position to take the blame. So even with this giant monster rampaging through the city and who knows how many millions or billions in property damage and people dead, that there's still politicking going on and kind of vying for power. And that's something that goes on throughout this movie too, is the US and other countries trying to leverage a disaster in another country for their own political gain, which I don't know if I would necessarily take that as anti-American. I guess you could, but definitely a sort of mentality that other countries are always waiting for a sign of weakness or a chance to step in and benefit themselves. I want to talk about the plans a little bit for each movie, because I thought the Minus One plan was very cool, where they did the Freon under Godzilla to try to rapidly sink him and force compression, and then the floaties to rapidly bring him back to the surface and have him deal with decompression as a way to make his body kind of go crazy. This one, they describe Godzilla more of being like a walking nuclear power plant. Like they mentioned him having nuclear fusion inside of him. So they want to cool him down suddenly, kind of the way that you would shut down a reactor plant, which is also a pretty interesting plan. As far as the implementation, I think that they're both well executed, but I think I like the Minus One plan better because the way that this plan works in Shin Godzilla is they have to pretty much completely immobilize him before they can get all this coolant into his mouth. And I get the message of this, of like the private citizens coming together. They're willing to sacrifice themselves to save their country. It's all very patriotic. They don't have to be there. They're choosing to be, which is also a thing in Minus One, where you have these former military people who are kind of looking for closure on war and to really be done with it and really move past it because it's still impacting their lives during the whole reconstruction effort in Japan in the late 1940s and 50s. And I'm assuming it went much longer than that. So yeah, so they're pretty similar in messaging, but the execution is definitely different. I think the thing that I struggle with in Shin Godzilla is that they've been shooting him and using tanks and bombs and MOABs and all this kind of special stuff, and he just kind of walks it off. And they do like these coordinated demolition strikes on their own buildings to collapse the buildings on him to knock him over and kind of stun him. And I like the idea of it. I just don't know how much sense it makes within the story where you've shown him withstand all this destruction and not really be impacted, but then have him be stunned long enough for them to pump, I think they say it's 675,000 gallons of coolant into him. So I like the plan. I just don't know logistically how much it makes sense. In Minus One, you have a similar idea where they have a couple boats go at Godzilla and make him use his fire breath or whatever it's called. He uses up his energy and has to recharge. And then he kind of floats there long enough for them to go circle around him to get the floats on. But they're fighting in the middle of the ocean and he's just kind of treading water. Or maybe his big ass just floats, I don't know. But either way, he's just kind of sitting there like confused because they're not doing anything. Which I guess you could say is also kind of bullshit. I think it makes sense. But as far as the plans themselves go, I like both. I think they're both pretty clever plans because they spend the whole movie in Shin trying to figure out his like DNA structure and stuff so they can create something to shut him down, which obviously is a very clever thing to do. And this is a pretty neat final shot we get of him just frozen in the middle of Tokyo. And both movies obviously end on a cliffhanger, leaving themselves open for sequels. The one thing I didn't really get to touch on is this movie, Yaguchi says people still died, and it kind of acknowledges that he had to make sacrifices for them to have victory, which is a little bit more realistic, but a little bit darker perspective compared to Minus One, where the whole thing is Shikamori building up to self-sacrifice only to change at the last minute and realize that they should be fighting for a future and not to just kill themselves. So they have their first win with no casualties, which obviously is a commentary on Japanese history and samurai culture. And there's a lot of cultures that have this where they'll spend lives like they're nothing. So they have different kind of messages there. I think Minus One's is probably more positive, and Shin's is probably more realistic. But they both have cool endings. They both end up with cliffhangers. You can see all the little things coming out of his tail there in Shin. But yeah, overall, they're both pretty good movies. They're both very fun movies. It's weird though, I actually think both movies probably could have been about maybe 10 minutes shorter in the planning stage. Like after your second act low point, you have about 30 minutes in both before the final Godzilla fight. And I feel like if those were trimmed down just a little bit, the pacing would feel quite a bit faster. And that's not a major criticism, that's just a kind of a feeling just watching them. I would say that I probably liked Minus One more because I feel like you can really get attached to the human element. And it's really a human story where Shikamori is trying to overcome his past and his regret and live for the future and learn what it means to have a family, even if they're not blood related, and to value the people around him, and like all of that stuff I feel like you can really get attached to. This one, the characters all seem to serve more as like a way to beat Godzilla. And there's like a million of them, so you don't really get much time with any of them. Where Minus One is a much smaller group. You have Shikamori, the girl living with him, their daughter, and then his couple friends from the boat. And that's mainly it. Like you get other people popping in to help with the planning and stuff, but as far as like the screen time and who it focuses on, it's just that little group. And I think I prefer that character element where it's a human story where Godzilla is an obstacle and also symbolic of his own guilt and his past and something he needs to overcome literally because it's Godzilla, and also metaphorically for himself so that he can move on with his life. I like that message. This one, I think the messages about government and bureaucracy and all that stuff are really fair, and that sacrifices have to be made and that you need people willing to step up like that to win in these life-threatening war type situations. But they're very different. So yeah, overall, it was a good recommendation from the comment section. So thanks guys for that. It's been nice watching two Godzilla movies that I've really enjoyed the last few weeks. It's a shame that Monarch won't turn it around, but I'm not too optimistic. I'm going to leave it there. So if you're here, leave a comment. Let me know if you like Shin better. Do you think I was unfair to it? Did you like Minus One better? Why? I know every YouTuber says that for the algorithm, but I actually do read all the comments since I can still do that with my channel size. And I try to respond to everything that's not just an insult. So if you comment, I will try to answer. And if you're still here, like and subscribe and all that. Thanks for the recommendation, guys. See ya.